Good to have you on with us, Harry. There are calls for immediate end to the hostilities, but I'm wondering what can be accomplished at this point. Are mediation and calls for a ceasefire pointless at this early stage?
This fighting ceases and that the humanitarian impacts of this confrontation are limited. But they're very unlikely to be very successful, those calls. And that is because there's a fundamental problem of trust, of course, between the SAF, the Sudan Armed Forces, and the Rapid Support Force on the other hand. Why, at the end of the day, would we just go back to sharing power and working together when we're absolutely convinced that the other side is trying to kill us and fundamentally things that our clear interests are to be dispensed with? And so from that standpoint, of course, it makes it very unlikely that international mediation is going to be accomplishing much, unless, of course, there's a clear winner of the confrontation that we're currently seeing in Khartoum and other parts of Sudan.
So, if when it gets to that point where the two sides would be willing to negotiate, who do you see as best positioned to act as mediator? Do you see a regional actor or from the wider international community?
Well, that's a difficult question because it depends a bit, of course, as I said, on what the outcome would be. I mean, ideally, of course, this would be the United Nations and the African Union with all the legitimacy that comes from this kind of broad front that they would be representing and all the legitimacy that comes with such organizations. But in actual fact, you almost certainly need real power and real influence over the Sudan Armed Forces and over the Rapid Support Forces. And now we have to look to a number of states much closer to Sudan. Egypt is often mentioned, the United Arab Emirates, both of which have important interests and ambitions in Sudan. Some of these may not necessarily be in line with what a lot of ordinary Sudanese people want, but they almost certainly have a degree of leverage over some of these actors that others simply don't. And that is, of course, a difficult balancing act to get right in the next couple of days or next couple of weeks, should the international community, or at least key parts of it, wish to try to influence developments on the ground in Sudan.
Where do you see things headed at this point? Do you see an increasing intensity in the conflict? Are we looking at potentially a more wider blown conflict?
Well, I think the real risk indeed is that you in the short term see some major evolution towards a SAF victory, a Sudan Armed Forces victory, but that the Rapid Support Forces would be able to pull back, for example, to Darfur or much broader parts of Western Sudan and commence some kind of longer term fight from there, potentially with foreign support. And that, I think, is the real nightmare scenario, because that would be the kind of the path to much wider civil war that wouldn't just be limited to clashes, mostly in urban centers and at military bases between these forces, but that would essentially bring about a much wider rupture in the country. And ironically, this is what both sides have very much been concerned about. I mean, at the heart of this is fundamental worries over whether Sudan can stay one country and what kind of institutions and what kind of political mechanisms can ensure that it does, and it doesn't follow down the route of Somalia or Libya or Syria. But of course, if both sides continue to be so intransigent and willing to understand where the others are coming from and to accommodate some of these interests, unfortunately, that much wider rift is a real possibility. And it would be very much a mistake to bet against that. And that is part of the reason why the international community should be paying much more attention to Sudan and shouldn't be making the mistakes it made earlier on in the transition, which was, amongst other things, to overlook these fundamental tensions between these two key institutions. I'm sorry. Because it's not just a matter of two men, of Burhan and Hemeti. It really is a matter of two institutions clashing and seeing the future in a fundamentally different way.
Sudan, of course, is no stranger to conflict, but I'm wondering about the humanitarian situation now with this latest rupture. People, it's Ramadan, of course, and many people have been fasting. I'm wondering if there's a danger of people running out of supplies because they're trapped in their homes.
Almost certainly there is. In the very, very short term, indeed, people are unable to go and buy things, but very importantly, people are also not able to go out and work and to get paid for that labor. For many ordinary Sudanese people, the ability to go out on a daily basis is what guarantees them ability to have at least one meal every day. If, because of the fighting, the closure of roads, the blockading of key transportation corridors, that is no longer possible, then what was already a very bad situation risks rapidly becoming fairly dramatic. In that sense, the calls of the UN Secretary-General were certainly no exaggeration. Sudan has been de facto in recession for about 10 years. Living standard of the vast majority of Sudanese people has plummeted dramatically in the last couple of years. And unfortunately, the transition has not been able to reverse that process. So seeing this happen, again, in Khartoum and other major urban centers really does risk indeed triggering this even broader and even deeper humanitarian crisis in the very short term, but not weeks or months of. This is happening today and the next few days, unfortunately.
All right, we're going to leave it there for now. Harry Verhoeven joining us from New York. Thank you.